We're going to continue also into the 18th and 19th century. So the first one to speak for us will be David Jacques. He is very known. He has a PhD in the garden history. He has a long list of achievements and books on his name. So we're very honored that he was willing to talk to us about the early steam engines, with a few examples starting in the 17th century and already taking us into the 18th century. So David, can I ask you to start? And I think it's Anastina who will share.
Yes, great. Okay, well, thank you, Renska. Hello, Steffi, and everyone. I want to talk about the first examples that I've found of steam engines. And there are two in particular that I've come across. One is Hampton Court, and the other is at Chiswick House. And I've got steam engines become, through the 18th century, the primary method of pumping water. So, can I have the first slide, please, right, okay. This image of 1702 shows the degree to which William had intended to have a magnificent display of fountains. If you look at this semicircular garden, just beyond the palace, there are 13 fountains that he was going to have in that garden. A parterre, by the way, which I think was probably larger than any other in Europe. So this was going to be a grand finale as far as he was concerned. Now, we've seen how William was in competition with Louis XIV at Versailles. And I just also want to introduce the Elector of Hanover, George Ludwig. He also wanted to join the race for the highest water jet in their gardens. But if you're in such a competition, of course, one of the foremost challenges is to procure the greatest water pressure. So Hetlow was lucky in having a supply of water on hand. And Peter the Great was lucky also at Peterhof to have a supply of water, though not as good as that at Hetlow. Chatsworth had the best supply of water of all, but usually water had to be raised to a cistern. I just want to mention one ancient and rather crude system, the chain pump. Instead of dropping a single bucket down a well, one could fix many buckets to an endless chain, which would be raised by means of a donkey engine. But in the 17th century, force pumps, as they're known, consisting of a piston with valves for letting water into a chamber and then letting it out, were widespread across Europe and formed the usual technology for town water supplies. They're not particularly efficient and required a lot of maintenance. And the greatest use of them was this monstrous machine de Marly, which has been introduced already this morning. 14 huge undershot water wheels driven by the River Seine that drove 221 force pumps that pushed water up 162 meters. So that perhaps was the greatest force pump machine ever made. If we now go to Hampton Court, the archives of the English Royal Office of Works are very full, and they demonstrate the extraordinarily high cost of the brickwork, the stonework, the lead pipework, and the brass stopcocks that were invested in this great garden. But unfortunately, the head of water was only 4 meters. So however good the supply and the pipework, the jets were only ever going to reach 2.5 to 3 meters after hydronic losses. This, of course, was very disappointing, and William needed a much higher pressures to achieve the effect he desired. But with wars to fight, the project was suspended for 10 years. He didn't lose heart, though, and resumed his quest in 1700. The works accounts show that a sculptor, John van Nost, produced a mock-up in lead. Next slide, please. It was a model of a fountain about 3 foot over. You can just see it at the bottom of the slide there, with 4 shells, 4 dolphins, 1 seahorse, and 11 other figures for the great fountain in the garden at Hampton Court. And this was put in place so that William could see what it would look like. At the same time, an experienced water supply engineer called Robert Aldersey was brought in to manage the water. He was an experienced water manager. He'd obtained a grant for the sole use of an engine for raising water. We're not quite sure what type of engine. That was in 1682, so a long time before. And he devised the engine for the London Bridge Waterworks, which supplied the City of London. Now, this was the time when functioning steam engines were becoming available from Thomas Savery. He is an English military engineer, and the practical problem that did more than any other to advance the technology of pumping was that of water in mines. Far greater power than was available from donkeys was required. Next slide, please. The very first crude steam engine was demonstrated by Savery in 1698. It worked on the principle that condensing steam in chamber S created a powerful suction that could draw water up, and that steam pressure, if you turn the valve at C, steam pressure entering chamber S could then expel it upwards. So it was sort of like a breathing machine, in and then out. No moving parts apart from the valves. And that was perhaps quite a problem because you needed some quick-witted attendants to keep the valves working in sequence. Savery obtained a patent for his new invention for raising water and occasioning motion of all sorts of millwork by the impellent force of fire. That was the name of his patent. That was in April 1699. Aldersey evidently suggested that Savery's engine might be tried out at Hampton Court. In a little book, The Miner's Friend, Savery recalled that, "Your Majesty having been graciously pleased to permit an experiment before you at Hampton Court of a small model of my engine described in the following treatise, and at that time to show a seeming satisfaction of the power and use of it." So Aldersey tapped into a large lead water main as it passed through the Wilderness Gate. That was if you imagine that slide, the first slide, that was to the left. The water was coming from that direction. So Savery tapped into that pipe. I think the engine must have been at the bottom of the house, and there was a cistern made on top of the house by a carpenter, and the carpenter also fixed pipes for the trial of the engine. This is all in the works accounts. This enabled enough pressure. Could I have the next slide, please? This enabled enough pressure to power the impressive jet, so that during the rest of 1700, Aldersey could conduct experiments of several jet dose and jerts of water before His Majesty at Hampton Court. These proved satisfactory, and some preparatory works were undertaken for a full-scale system. Aldersey made improvements to the water supply and afterwards provided brasses for the fountains. That's probably the spouts and possibly the turncocks. And he had entered an agreement with the Royal Gardens as from Christmas 1701 to continue to raise water for the fountains at the salary of £200 per annum. However, he died a few months later, and his successor, Queen Anne, who was no friend of William, was not interested, and the project collapsed. Next one, please. A few years later, we find Aldersey at Blenheim Palace, installing a force pump driven by a huge water wheel contained within or perhaps adjacent to the Great Bridge. Here's a slide of from the Great Bridge, looking towards the east front of the house, and at the top of the east front was a great cistern which supplied the palace with water. Meanwhile, George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, next please. Thank you. Was entering the competition for the highest jet d'eau. He had a portrait medal cast in 1701 commemorating the coming of age of his heir, George August. George Ludwig was actually to become George I of England and Ireland, and George August was going to be George II. This medal showed a powerful fountain jet on the obverse, which really signaled his intent, but he didn't manage to create the jet straight away. His first practical step was to create the basin, which was 50 meters in diameter. And you can see that in the bottom half of the slide. So you've got the main jet in the middle of the bosquets, and then 4 smaller jets in the middle of each of the 4. Now, Herrenhausen was on a floodplain, so some powerful engine would be required to create the required pressure. He sought out several experts, and including Thomas Severy, although nothing came of that. The most promising ideas centered around harnessing the power of the River Lena. You can just see a little bit of it in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, which passed close to the garden. But this great engine would be unaffordably expensive, and George Ludwig had made frustratingly little progress by the time he was offered the British and Irish crowns in 1714. Time to introduce William Benson, a landowner from near Amesbury in Wiltshire, ambitious politically, and in 1706 had been amongst those Englishmen to have presented himself to George Ludwig at the court of Hanover. He entered parliamentary elections, and what swung the grateful electors of Shaftesbury was Benson's new water supply to the town. For this, he'd used the expertise of a curate called Thomas Holland. And Holland was something of an expert, having installed water pumps at Wilton House, probably to run the Neptune fountain in the 1690s. When George returned to Hanover in 1716 for 6 months, Benson attended him. Seeing an opportunity to assist George with his fountain works, he claimed the water engine at Shaftesbury as his own conception and offered his services. Benson's scheme was accepted, and the contracts were signed in 1717. Next slide, please. Benson brought over the foreman and blacksmith who'd made the engine at Shaftesbury. In Holland's design, the cylinders were arranged in pairs and the pistons linked by a chain over a pulley. You can see on the slide how that took place, so that when the piston was down in one cylinder, it was up in the other. With several pairs of pistons, the power was delivered smoothly, and not unlike the principle of the modern internal combustion engine. The most ingenious feature was the way in which the power in the crankshaft was transferred to the pistons. This was achieved by catches springing out from collars around the shaft and dragging the chains down for half the rotation. They would then withdraw for the rest of the rotation, during which time the other piston would be dragged down by catches on the other collar. Fiendishly complicated mechanism, and required the skills of a locksmith to make it all work. And indeed, they were called locks by the water engineers. In 1719, with the engine in place and a cast-iron pipe laid to the fountain, George, in the presence of ministers and the court, attended a trial run of the jet, expected to reach over 35 meters. But to his great mortification and humiliation, it reached only 17 feet, which is more like 5 meters. As a matter of prestige, the jet had to work better whatever the cost. And feeling that he must have been fooled, that must have passed through his mind, but he pursued the project, and Benson managed in the end to get the 100 feet from this great machine, which took all the power of the River Lane to make it run. So he'd done rather better than Peter the Great, who had only a 21-meter jet at Peterhof near St. Petersburg. Now, turning now to Chiswick House, Lord Burlington wanted a cascade, though there was no water supply. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, there's a later view of the jet at Herrenhausen, which was a great sort of, tourist attraction for 100 years. Next one, please. So this is what Burlington wanted at Chiswick. And this is a sketch by William Kent showing how he would have dressed it up and how it would be a cascade. But there's no water supply, certainly no pressure. So we find the steward at Chiswick asking for money from one of his fellow stewards up in Yorkshire who had income from mines, explaining that I should not so often repeat the want of money to you, did not the great difficulties that I be under constrain me to it. Money must be had. And you can hear Burlington behind that. It would almost distract you to see what numbers of hands are at work at Chiswick, masons, bricklayers, carpenters, scarce numerable, besides 20 labourers or upwards in the gardens, and near 40 employed in digging drains and laying pipes for conveyance of water to the canals, which is to be raised out of the Thames by a fire engine, for which purpose a house is now building. Next, please. If you look to the left of the villa at Chiswick, in the field in front, there is a hexagonal tower. And I think that may well have been the engine house for the machine. And 20 years later, one of Savary's employees claimed that he had made one of the largest Savary engines ever built to raise the ornamental waters in the gardens of the Earl of Burlington. I presume that the engine pumped water to a tank on top of this structure, and the lead pipework laid in trenches conveyed the water under pressure to the back of the cascade, but that's an assumption. Now, Savory engines were very troublesome and time-consuming to run. It was all right if you had a mine in Cornwall or something, and you had plenty of people working for you to keep turning all the valves. But for a garden project, it was certainly very time-consuming to run such an engine. And indeed, at Chiswick, Lord Burlington converted his engine house to a more primitive chain pump after a few years. Next one, please. And here is the cascade in 1753, now being supplied by the chain pump. Although the Herrenhause engine was highly sophisticated and survived for many decades, it in fact was not to be the model for the future. Steam engines were continuously improved through the 18th century by Thomas Newcomen, James Watt, and others to become more efficient and more reliable. I should say that some of these engines were used in the Netherlands and the Belgian Netherlands for pumping out the polders. During the 19th century, new forms of steam engine were achieving absolute wonders in raising large quantities of water on railways, of course, and in fountain. So that was the start of fire engines in gardens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this very interesting view into the early beginning of steam engines and the enormous amount of trouble people went through even in this 17th, 18th century to still have this power combat for who has the biggest, as Lenneke put it earlier this morning. It's really a power display, and it's really a way to impress everybody. And but it's also the ins and outs of all those technical innovations. That's very intriguing, I find.